Hello, and welcome to a sunny book nook. Today I'm in a different location because, oh my god, my voice. Today I'm in a different location because I am currently traveling, and there's the ocean right behind you, my camera, and if you hear the waves of the ocean crashing against the shore, just appreciate it, you know? Some nice background noise. Okay, so today what we are talking about is the best books that I have read this year, 2021. It's June. We're halfway through the year. Hotel tea. We're halfway through the reading year, and I thought that it was a good time to kind of wrap up the 5-star books that I've read this year. I've read a lot of really good books that I didn't give 5 stars. You can friend me on Goodreads and look at all my books that I read this year. When I was counting up and rounding up the amount of books that I had rated very highly, I got to a pretty even number of 10 books that I've read this year and that I rated 5 stars. So I just want to give you that list today. If you want an honorable mentions video, let me know. I just wanted to make this pretty quickly and get that out there. Please subscribe if you haven't already. I know a lot of you are not subscribed. I can see the channel analytics. Yeah, the list that I'm going to be going through, I'm going to be going through it in terms of the earliest I've read this year to the most recent that I've read. So if you've been keeping up with my monthly wrap-ups, which you should if you haven't, if you don't, you'll recognize these titles because I wrap them up, obviously. Also, one other thing, I do not have any of these books with me physically, although I do own some of them physically, obviously because I'm traveling. The first book that I read this year that really blew me out of the water was The Changeling by Victor Laval. This book is one that I've talked about quite a few different times on the channel, besides in my January wrap-up, but also in my book recommendations for books set in New York City, because this book is very much a New York City book, and it's following this man who is a bookseller. We follow his origin story almost of his parents meeting and then him being born and then him getting into the book trade and then him starting his own family. But when he starts his own family, he has a wife, and his wife has a child, and his child is someone he's obsessed. He's a new father. He's obsessed with his child, and he posts pictures of his kid and puts them on the internet. Nothing particular seems to be going wrong until one day his wife kills their baby right in front of him in the kitchen, saying that that is not their baby. It has been replaced with a changeling, because it's kind of based off of a fairy tale sort of situation where there's a fairy tale like trope where there's this thing called a changeling, which is what replaces a child when like a fairy or a witch or something steals that child for nefarious deeds or whatever. And we kind of follow the adventure and the horror of him uncovering the reality of what is going on. But it's so much more than that, because it looks at race in this very critical way, because our main character is a black man and he has to navigate the policing of the city in his goose chase across the entire city, looking for his kid, looking for his wife who has run off somewhere, he doesn't know where, and also there is a book-selling mystery involved and entangled deeply within the story. It's really complicated. It's hard to summarize. I feel like the synopsis on Goodreads and on the back of this book there's no real way to describe it besides the vibes that are very like gothic and dark, but yet still modern in the way that it incorporates technology, and still fast-paced in the way that the adventure and the like wildness of what's going on just keeps coming at you. This sort of look at family and struggle, and it's just very beautiful, and I really enjoyed it, and I was enraptured the entire time I was reading this book. I think I listened to this on audio, and I recommend the audiobook for sure as well. In terms of where to listen to audiobooks, if you don't have the app Libby, Libby, get that. You just have to have a library card. Same with the free app Hoopla. Also has audiobooks on it. Again, need a library card. Those are my primary recommendations in terms of audiobooks. So that is my first favorite book of the year so far that I read. And then I want to talk about this other book that is very short because it's a manifesto. It's called the Gender Accelerationist Manifesto. You can find it for free online. It's just like a few pages of a PDF, and it just talks about queer liberation against capitalism and imperialism and the ways that these forces and these entities are all deeply tied together, and it does it in such a succinct and accurate and well-worded way. I thought that it was such an engaging read, and it's so necessary. I think it ties together a lot of the ideas and the theories of feminism and queer liberation and Marxism and decolonization, all these things into a very coherent analysis that does function as a manifesto to accelerate the process of the degradation of gendered cis heteropatriarchy. So, very necessary read. The next book I read this year that just blew me out of the water was The Color Purple by Alice Walker. This book is a sapphic, black feminist, seminal read. It is a classic, and it is very clear why it is. It's about a poor young black woman who grows up in the rural South, and she comes from an incredibly traumatic background. Definitely look up trigger warnings and content warnings for this book if you want to get into it, because it talks about gendered violence in such an explicit way, because the format of the book is that of prayers initially and then letters. The way that these characters' relationships with each other and the violence and the horror and the grief found within the very real feeling lives. This book is like stepping into a gritty period drama, but much better and just so incredible. I definitely think this is a book that everyone should read, and I think the way that it talks about both spirituality and love and how people change and grow over time, and how the people that hurt you can also be people who are truly inescapable in your life and necessary almost. The way that those dynamics are so fraught, and the way that the positionality of these characters are so that they are stuck in a place that they really have no autonomy or control of. We just go through it with these characters, and it's just so tragic and beautiful. It's not all tragedy. I think it is more beauty than tragedy, because it is about the wretched lives of people who are suffering the worst of the ills of the world, yet it's so humanizing and spiritual in every way, and it's just such a wonderful book, and I cried when I read it, for sure. So I think the beginning is kind of slow and hard to get into, but that's true for almost any classic, to be honest, but it's so worth it when you get to the end. So, love this book. The next book that I read this year that just was so incredible was Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. I love Brandon Sanderson's writing. I think the way that he can construct a world and these characters that are dynamic and particular is just so incredible and truly unmatched. I feel kind of bad saying that about a man who's otherwise just like your average mediocre white Utah Mormon, but his books are truly incredible in the way that the ideas, these grander ideas of like war and nationhood and religion and political machinations of these fake worlds and this magic that doesn't actually exist that he can bring to life so vibrantly. It's incredible. It's amazing, and I just love it. And this book is no different, because Warbreaker is following the perspectives of these sisters who are princesses of a kingdom in the north. So this northern kingdom is really afraid to go to war with their richer southern kingdom, right? Because there's like a treaty, and they're supposed to be... Ooh, I just smacked something. There's a treaty, they're supposed to be like friendly, but there's rumors of war, and in order to potentially stop that war, one of the princesses who's been raised her entire life to be the princess who gets married to the god king, the ruler of the Southern Kingdom, to be the ruler's wife. Last minute, the king of the North decides to have her stay at home in the Northern Kingdom with him and help rule and govern the kingdom as this inevitable war, it seems, is going to come about. So instead of that sister being sent, her younger sister gets sent, and her younger sister is someone who has never had to think about her role within the political kingdom. She's just a free spirit. She doesn't pay attention in her classes because she doesn't feel like there's a need to, because she has no real role in the kingdom, because her older brothers and sisters all have their roles and they've already taken those positions as whatever they need to do for the kingdom, for whenever her dad passes away, the king, or, whatever. But then last minute she gets thrust into this marriage with the God King. And the thing is that the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom are incredibly different in their religious beliefs and political systems, because the magic that people can practice and believe in is that there is energy and magic in breath, and breath is kind of the life force within you. And it is also present in inanimate objects that can be animated through the use of color. So color and breath are kind of linked together, and they are what makes life. And so the more vibrant, the more animate something is, or someone is, and the more perceptive someone is, the more vibrant they are as a person, they have more breath. There's a lot of rules and stuff in terms of how you can get breath, and it has to be freely given. You can live as someone without breath, but you're known as a drab, because if you don't have breath, it's just very hard. It's hard to live and it's hard to be perceived, basically. So that's another element of the story. But the thing is that the Northern Kingdom, our girls, our princesses, are not familiar with this culture at all, because in their Northern Kingdom, the culture and the systems at play are very much in favor of abstinence and frugalness, and not being colorful or bright. When the sisters visit the city, the Southern Kingdom, that is rich and bustling with life, for the first time, they are astonished because they've never even seen many of the colors that are present in that city in a casual manner, and present in the marketplace and what people are wearing. Because in the North, because the values are placed on being modest and not wearing any bright colors, the preservation of modesty is always a priority. So because the value system is so different, it's such a culture shock. So we follow that story, and the way that our main characters are trying to avoid this war, but also trying to further it, or trying to benefit their own kingdom. And we're also following the perspective of one of the gods of the Southern Kingdom, because another part of the religion in the Southern Kingdom is that there are these people who have been brought back to life again, and when they've been brought back to life, they basically have been revived from their past self. So their past self died in something, doing something, but instead of dying, they came back to life because they have some higher purpose to serve. And so because they came back to life, they are now living in the palace with the God King, who is the Lord ruler of them all. But there's so many court politics involved, and there's so many limitations to what you can do as a god, and what does it even mean to be a god? Because really this religious system was just made up by people anyways, and what is there to say if you're not just a god, you're just a random guy that they picked off the street to be chosen as such. And so we're following this character named Lightsong, and we're seeing his perspective, because he is a god in the Southern Kingdom, but he is really just racked with the question of, why am I a god? Who was I in my past life? And why, what is the purpose of this all? Because he's known as, the clown of the, court. He does not care about politics. He just doesn't care, but he gets roped into some stuff. But anyway, I'm talking about this book for so long, but it's because it's a Brandon Sanderson fantasy, it's just, really hard to describe both the technical machinations of the world as well as what makes it interesting in a succinct sort of way. It's just hard, but trust me, this book It is so twisty and turny, and our characters are so dynamic. There's all these different little crews, various pathways that we follow, the nature of things that get unraveled, and like there's a point in the middle of the book where everything shifts because we find out something that it really twists and turns the entire like path of the story. Like it's wild, and I love it so much. I think it is just incredible, and I really enjoyed it. And it's a standalone too. I think there might be a sequel coming up, but Brandon Sanderson is always working on a bunch of different series at the same time. I don't know how he does it, so we'll see. Okay, so the next book I have here, well, I don't physically have it, but I do physically own it. I also do physically own The Color Purple and Warbreaker, which you would know if you've been watching my wrap-up since the beginning of this year. But the next book that I want to talk about is The Castle of Truth and Other Revolutionary Tales by Helene Zur-Mühlen. This book is a collection of short stories that were translated, I think, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, from German. They're these socialist fairy tales. The woman who wrote these short stories was a communist or a socialist in Germany, and was trying to kind of disseminate those ideas through these children's stories, through literal fairy tales. So she wrote a bunch of fairy tales, and they are so good. It's such an interesting approach to revolutionary thinking and ideas in a way that's so palatable and accessible. And I think that if you are interested in learning about the ideologies of liberation and workers' collectives and, you know, anti-capitalism and whatever, this is probably a pretty good place to start, because it really breaks down what class functions as and how it is reinforced throughout society, and how workers can rebel against the system at play and free themselves of their own exploitation, and the ways that people become corrupted through money, through power, through capitalism, in a very simple way, because it's fairy tales for children. I very much highly recommend it. And even if you don't really care about politics or anything, or don't want to learn more about that, or don't think it's relevant to your life, the stories themselves as stories are really compelling as is, and I think that you'll get something out of it, and you will kind of get an understanding of what fairy tales are really supposed to do and how they actually work and function in this really interesting way. And I truly cannot recommend this book enough. I just think it's amazing. So, also on my Instagram, which is always linked down in the description below, you can follow me there if you want, but beware, I don't post bookish stuff most of the time. I mean, sometimes I do. It's mostly just like my photography and my art, but I do talk about it sometimes. I do talk about books sometimes, and I have an IGTV series and like I did like an Instagram live show series of me reading aloud some of these short stories, and people seem to like them, and they're still up if you want to go watch them, so you can go ahead and do that if you would like. The next book I want to talk about is The Divines by Ellie Eaton. I think that this book is just such an interesting blend. It's literary fiction. It's adult contemporary literary fiction, but it takes on the perspectives and the experiences of young girls in this way that is so wonderful. Basically, we are following this alternating perspective of this woman who is in her 30s, and the same woman who's in her 30s now, being a teenager at a boarding school when she was a teenager in boarding school. We're following this woman after she's been married. She's just gotten married, she's on her honeymoon, and she goes with her husband to the place that her boarding school used to be, and that launches her into reminiscing and about her experiences there. Half of the chapters are about her life at boarding school, and those chapters are filled with the petty but violent and cruel girl antics, like what happens when you're put in, a boarding school away from your family. It's in Britain, it's pretty posh, and it's just like 100 teenage girls whose moms all went there, and there's a culture at this boarding school where it's just very insular because, you know, it's like in the early 2000s, it's like the 90s. There's no internet, you don't communicate with people outside of this setting. You're really just locked into this boarding school and the social dynamics and dramas that it encompasses. And because it's such like a limited amount of people as well, everyone knows everyone, obviously, like by name, and the social hierarchies feel so stiff, you know, because it's like high school, and high school just always feels that way. There's like the popular girls and the mean girls and the one girl that no one likes, and our main character gets stuck in this like roommate situation, this randomized roommate situation with the most unpopular girl, and so and also the boarding school antics and the culture of this boarding school is so interesting to see. It's because it's so British and it's so posh, and everyone calls each other by like a boy nickname. Our main character's name is Jessamine, but everyone calls her Jo, and just like stuff like that, right? We are also seeing her, you know, decades later when she's a grown adult, thinking back about the experiences she had and sort of the gender dynamics that go on at, you know, these like strict conservative, like all girls boarding schools, but also like the queerness and the intimacy of girlhood in contrast to how vicious it can be, and how it kind of, that experience haunts our main character Jo for the rest of her life, and as an adult, because as an adult she's still racked with memories and the guilt of her experiences at boarding school, because at the very beginning of the story we know that there was a really bad accident that happened. Jo was involved in it, and anyway, this is another book that's pretty complicated to explain, but it's just a book that you have to get into, and then once you get into it, you just don't want to stop. I think towards the beginning, maybe like the 15% mark, I was like, oh no, I just feel like this is gonna be boring or whatever, but then I kept listening, because I was listening to the audiobook, which I really recommend, and I was like, wait, the complexity of these character relationships and the power dynamics at play and the exploration of like youth and memory and how it shapes you and how it shapes others and social dynamics, whoa, incredible. Also on me and my best friend's podcast, Lavender Menace, which you should listen to and subscribe to. We're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We talk about pop culture, so some book stuff, lots of like movies and TV shows and music and stuff, and it's like a comedy podcast, so we think we're funny. We hope you do too. But me and my co-host Renaissance, we were able to interview the author of The Divines, Ellie Eaton, which was such a cool experience. I think it's our 4th episode or 5th. We got to talk to her about, you know, all our favorite parts of this book, because after I read this book, I was like losing my mind, because I was like, Renaissance, you need to read this book. And then so they did. And then we were like tweeting about it, and we reached out to the author, and Ellie was kind enough to, you know, speak to us about it. So this is definitely one of the best books I read this year, and honestly, just, it's so underrated. I think both on Goodreads and on here, on YouTube, like, people don't really talk about it or don't rate it that highly, but it's such an interesting portrait of womanhood and girlhood and, like, getting to that place. Ugh, I loved it so much. Oh yeah, listen to our interview podcast episode. I think a lot of what we have to say about the book is really integral to understanding it in the after, because when you finish this book, like, the very end of this book kind of just fucking smacks you in the face. Like, something just happens. My jaw dropped. Like, I was like, what the hell? So when you're done with that, you're gonna be like, oh no, like, you're gonna want to talk about it, you're gonna want to know more, you're gonna want to seek out people to talk about it with. So I highly recommend listening to our podcast episode after you finish this book, because you should read it, and in fact you must. The next book I want to talk about is another book that I physically own, and that is Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. This book I don't want to get into for too long, because so many people have already talked about this on BookTube and on the book internet, and it was a bestseller and it's won a bunch of awards, but it's a generational story about a Korean family, and it's incredible. The characterization, amazing, plot, like setting, everything. It's written in a way that's very accessible as well. Like, it's pretty simply written, but in a way that really conveys these characters in such a compelling way. And we see the reality of imperialism, colonialism, and poverty, gender violence, exploring your sexuality as like a woman, and like all these things in an incredible way. Love this so much. The next book I want to talk about is Phoenix Extravagant by Yoon Ha-lee, another book that I talked about in my most recent wrap-up, I believe. And this book is a queer sci-fi fantasy that is almost speculative in the way that it creates a world that very much mirrors Japanese imperialism in Korea, and makes it a sci-fi thing. Puts robots and machinations in there, puts some dragons in there, puts some art and magic in there, puts some non-binary character in a sapphic relationship, and enemies to lovers, like prison guard to, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's good, and I loved it. And because I already talked about this in a recent video, I'm not going to get much more into it, but you know what I mean. Another book that I talked about in a recent video in my wrap-up is Princess Floralinda in the 40 Flight Tower by Tamsin Muir. And I also talked about this on the podcast because part of the Lavender Menace structure is that at the very end of the podcast, me and Renaissance recommend to each other media that we think the other person would enjoy, and Renaissance really enjoys fairy tale retellings, and that's what this book is. It's a novella, and it is so cute and sentimental, but not in a corny way, in like a funny way, in a little quirky way, and it really talks about what being a princess, being a girl, and then how dynamic that is, and how our main character changes so much in her attempt at survival, and how this fairy that is stuck in the tower with her when she gets blown in through the window is also, and it's a cute like sapphic genderqueer situation as well, because the fairy is a fairy, it doesn't have a gender, up until the point that our main character, Princess Floralinda, assigns it, okay, do you want to be a girl or a boy? And the fairy is like, well, which one is better? And Floralinda is like, that's not really how it works, but I mean, I think you're really pretty, so you're gonna be a girl. It's very cute. It's about Floralinda battling these like monsters on every like level of the tower to fight for herself to be able to leave, because all these princes who are trying to save her are not succeeding. So yeah, I recommended this to Renaissance in our not our most recent episode, on our second to most recent episode. Now, finally, the last book I'm talking about to you today as my favorite books of the year so far is Yellow Jessamine by Caitlin Starling. This book is a novella. It's another gothic speculative fantasy, and it is also sapphic and queer and lovely, and oh my gosh, I finished this book yesterday, so I haven't talked about this on the channel yet, unlike all the other books. And it is, as soon as I finished the book, I was like, this is going to be one of my favorite books of the year, because of how atmospheric and lovely it is, but also how much dread you feel when you're reading it, because we're following our main character who is in a mourning gown. So there's a mourning veil, and she always wears all black, and she is the only woman who is on the board of this city, but the city is dying because it has been resisting being enfolded into the empire, because the empire is like encroaching and it's taken in and enfolded into a lot of cities, but this city is trying to remain independent. And our main character is a woman who is in mourning and in grief, and she owns these ports and a bunch of ships, and she's one of like the primary, the people who get shit done within the city who like own it, and she's the only woman. She's always in rooms full of men who overlook her because she's just a woman in mourning, someone who happened to be the widower, well, the only one who was left alive when all the men in her family died. But our main character has a secret, obviously, and that is she is a poisoner. She can brew items in her garden, because at her manor she has a garden, and she can use poisons to kill people and also to, you know, heal people and do specific things. So through this, and through, by the nature of her ability to do this, and through her persona as a strong, mourning, eccentric woman, she is able to get away with the amount of power that she has, but it's a very tricky balance that she has to maintain, and some disease is spreading throughout the city that came off of one of her ships, and so she has to make some hard decisions and do some not nice things. Our main character is very morally gray. She makes some very poor decisions and kills people and her handmaiden, her lady in waiting, you know, the lady who follows her around and takes all her orders and whatever, they're not in a relationship, but it's very emotionally intimate, and our main character does not like men. All the men who show her romantic interest in the story she's not into that. So even though no one's sexuality or no one's relationship is like explicitly written to the story, it's pretty explicitly queer. And I was looking at some Goodreads reviews the other day and of this book after, you know, I finished it and was giving it my star rating and my reviews and my initial thoughts after I finished it. And I saw people being like, oh, there's some people who don't like this book because they think it's like queer baiting, which, okay, that's a whole other issue. Or they think it's not horror enough. It's been marketed as like a scary book, but it's not scary. But the thing is that if it's not scary in a jump scare way, it's gothic. Like, it's truly a gothic story, and it's about our main character experiencing so much fear and anxiety and dread as more and more things are crashing down around her and more complications are arriving, and there's this disease that seems to be tracking her down specifically, and the only person she can trust in her life is her maiden. So it's just so good, and I really, really enjoyed it, and it's an underrated sapphic gothic read, and I think it came out this year as well. I think it was a recent release, so I highly recommend this book. Please let me know your thoughts on it if you have read it, because I'm still kind of stuck in that world, because you know how books give you like hangovers sometimes and you just want to read more and more of that type of book? That's what this is giving me. Honestly, all the books that I've talked about today are giving me that energy. So thank you so much for watching. That's all I have for you today. These are all of my 5-star reads, all 10 of my 5-star reads that I have read so far in the year. Let me know if you've read any of these and whether you would be interested in reading any of these. If you haven't, like, comment, subscribe, you know, all that bullshit. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!